Alright everybody, welcome back to another edition of Bear's Guide 205. This time we are tackling the Unit 3 review for AP Human Geography, focusing on the chapters Culture, Language, and Religion. Now, as always, these review videos are a little bit longer than the normal ones, so don't be afraid to take a break and break up these videos and try not to tackle it all in one sitting if you can. Now, as always, while I'm going through the review, you want to focus on one, do I remember this stuff and can I use this stuff? And two, how does it relate to other topics that we have covered in AP Human Geography? Because this class should be looked at as a whole, and each one of these chapters are pieces to that whole picture. Starting off with Chapter 4, we're going to focus first on the differences between pop and folk culture. Now, popular culture is practiced by large heterogeneous groups. That means different people in all different places around the world, and it spreads rapidly through migration, especially expansion diffusion. And popular culture generally originates from specific sources, usually for profit. Whereas folk culture is practiced by small homogeneous groups in very unique places. And this is going to spread slowly through migration, especially that relocation diffusion. Now, it originates in multiple anonymous sources, and it's based on everyday life in that community. So we don't really know where it's from, and it doesn't really spread out far. And the people that practice it generally stay in that place where they're practicing. Now, when we look at the effects of pop and folk culture, we see that it impacts this thing called the cultural landscape. Now, the cultural landscape is anything humans have built, anything at all, right? It's the everyday buildings, it's the unique pieces of land where we can identify, a specific culture to it. So a cultural landscape can show a pop culture or a folk culture, right? When we looked at pictures of folk culture, when you see the pyramids or you see the Eiffel Tower, you instantly know that those are unique to those people's culture. But then if you look at any other building, that's also the cultural landscape. But what gets confusing is that those everyday buildings that you can't distinguish where people are, that's the uniform landscape, where everything begins to look the same. Right? And when pop culture keeps spreading throughout the world, this heterogeneous culture that everybody can take in and digest, as a result of cultural imperialism, the cultural landscape begins to look the same and create that uniform landscape. But the uniform landscape is still part of the cultural landscape. It is a reflection of our culture. So what happens when culture spread? So as pop culture starts to spread around the world, or even folk culture, but more importantly pop culture, we see three things happen. Either syncretism with the blending of ideas, acculturation where people adopt a second culture and code switch between them, or just straight assimilation. They drop the first culture they originally have and pick up the second culture. And this generally happens when people who practice folk cultures in other countries are exposed to pop culture through pop culture imperialism, and then they pick that up instead. Or if they move to a new place and they assimilate to that major culture that exists. And that takes us into cultural imperialism, and syncretism. So cultural imperialism, when pop culture takes over and replaces folk culture, pop culture is very good at spreading. It can spread through different technologies like the internet, movies, TV, and it displaces that traditional folk culture, because why practice a culture of only a couple thousand people instead of practicing a culture of billions of people? So it becomes much more enticing to do that. Or you get cultural syncretism, where you get a mix of pop and folk culture, and we've seen unique examples of that. Now, imperialism and syncretism only happen because of acculturation and assimilation, right? When people join a new culture, when people move to a new place, when people come to the United States, people say, oh, they've become Americanized, either because they practice acculturation where they switch between their two cultures, or they just straight assimilate, right? And they become part of that culture. But that can happen even in other countries. They don't have to move to a country to be assimilated or to practice acculturation. Once again, cultural imperialism can happen because of TV and movies and the internet, and people just wanting to be like that popular culture. Now, if you have two different cultures that come in contact with each other, it's called a contact zone, and sometimes those contact zones can turn violent, and it's referred to as a shatter belt when they turn violent. And we're going to talk more about the conflict between Muslims and Hindus in India and Pakistan, which are a great example of a shatter belt. We have talked about it in the class, but in the aspect of this review, that's going to be in the next PowerPoint when we talk about devolution and stuff like that. But we know this is a great example for the curriculum of a shatter belt. So on to Chapter 5, we're talking about language now, a aspect of culture, whether it be pop culture languages or folk culture languages. But first we have to break down how we classify languages. So we know that we break them apart from largest to smallest, families, branches, and then groups. Families are those collections of languages that are pre-writing, prehistoric. Branches are the languages with a recent ancestor in the last 1500 years. And finally, groups are literally the single language with their collection of dialects. That's why it's referred to as a group for one language, because you get all those dialects. And that takes us to dialects, which is a particular form of that language group. And dialects are separated by three things: how they spell words, how they pronounce words, and the vocabulary that they use, right? So we know that English is a language group, but in English you have like Americanized English and then you have British English, which are pretty different. And then even within dialects or inside of countries, you get these things called isoglosses, where we know that in the United States there are different dialects based on where you are in the US. And we use these words to help us identify where we are in the US, right? And that can be expanded to other countries. This is just a concept. But this also helps us identify like vernacular regions and helps us identify different aspects of pop and folk culture. So if we had to use an example of how to use a breakdown of languages, we would, if we were using English, we would say the family is Indo-European, the branch is Germanic, and then finally the group is English. And then we would talk about the individual dialects. And we used a tree as the metaphor to kind of figure these out, right? That the trunks of the trees are the family, the branches are branches, and then the individual leaves are the groups, right? And if you follow these back, you can see where some languages are used by a whole lot of people, some languages just aren't. But what's unique about this is that you can see the common traits between all the different languages. Like if you look at the branch for Romance, you have all of these languages, and you wonder to yourself, if you've ever spoke Spanish and then heard Italian, you're like, wow, those are similar words or similar sentence structure, because they're all on the same Romance branch, right? Whereas the West Germanic languages, kind of tough to have things in common, but they do because they're all Indo-European languages. Now, briefly, we have to also talk about why English, that's on the Germanic branch, is related to the Romance language branch. And that's because England had a history of where Norman-speaking or French-speaking Normans conquered England for a certain amount of time, and it just infused some Romance language words into the English language. Those are our fancy words like rendezvous and croissant and chandelier and sherbet or sherbet or whatever. These are our fancy words. Just a fun fact. Indo-European is the largest language family in the world. And in the Indo-European family, you have to know the four largest branches: the Indo-Iranian, the Romance, Germanic, and Balto-Slavic, with their respective most spoken language. Indo-Iranian being Hindi, Romance being Spanish, Germanic being English, and Balto-Slavic being Russian. But Indo-European is also so prominent because it has spread all around the world through colonialism. And we talk a lot about the impacts of colonialism, and one of those impacts that a lot of people ignore is the spread of the Indo-European languages, and why that languages like English and Spanish are spoken all around the world. So this puts about half of all people into areas which speak an Indo-European language. And then the second largest language family in the world is Sino-Tibetan, as you can see on this pie chart. And the only reason that Sino-Tibetan has such a large amount of speakers is because of Mandarin Chinese, which is the most spoken language group in the world. That's mentioned here. Now, there are some theories on how the Indo-European language came to be, and you have to understand these two theories. You have the Kurgan-Hirth theory and the Anatolian Hirth theory. What you got to know with the Kurgan-Hirth is that it originates from Central Asia and spreads out from there, while the Anatolian Hirth theory starts in modern-day Turkey and spreads outwards. And sometimes students get confused on how to differentiate between these. The Kurgan-Hirth theory had this idea that these group of nomadic people were going around and pillaging and destroying and killing others and kind of forcing them to learn the language as they conquered. So Kurgan you can associate with killing, where the Anatolian Hirth theory was about trading in modern day Turkey, trading agricultural goods as so the language spread as a need of business. So you can think Anatolian agricultural, right? And when we think about these words, the reason why we think that there's a common ancestor is because language groups that are far different on the Indo-European tree have some common words, because at the time of either of these theories, they had words for the things that they saw. But then as people migrated away from these areas into other parts of the planet and encountered new things, they had to come up with new words for those things, and that's why they get different words. So here's an example. If during the time of the Anatolian Hirth theory and people had a word for wheat that everybody used, so in modern day times, a language group that is far separated from another one have a common word or common root to the word for wheat. Whereas once they diffused out of that area and migrated out of that area, they both encountered what is now, like say an ocean, and then they had to come up with individual words for that, and those words would be different. All right, now we're moving on to unique things about the Romance language branch. The Romance language branch is named because it's after the Romans. It's based in Latin. Rome conquered much of Europe, and when they conquered much of Europe, they had everybody around speaking this very common form of Latin. And after the Roman Empire fell, these individual places were isolated, so they used their languages and kind of mixed and made all the Romance languages that we are used to seeing. These ones are Spanish, French, Italian, Romansh, and Portuguese. So what are the intervening obstacles to these people migrating, bringing in the migration chapter? We see that those mountains are in the way, and this creates the unique languages that exist, but still all tied to the root Latin. Now we get into different language types, how we classify languages. A lingua franca is one of them. If you used English as a lingua franca, it is a language of international trade, but it also must be a different language than the primary languages. So for example, if a German businessman and a Japanese businessman meet, they're going to speak English because they know they have that common language that they can both speak. But if a Japanese businessman met with an American, English would not be used as the lingua franca for the American because that's their primary language, right? So there's two aspects of lingua francas that you have to understand, is that yes, it is for international trade, but it also must be different than the primary language that they speak. Some notable lingua francas that you should know: Arabic, Chinese, French, Russian in the old Soviet Union, Spanish, and Swahili in East Africa. I wouldn't memorize all of them, but I would definitely think to know maybe one or two extra lingua francas just in case it comes up on the AP exam. Then we get our pidgin languages, which are a simplified mix of two languages used to conduct basic business between two people who don't speak each other's language. So Spanglish is a great example for this, that when you're taking what English you know and what Spanish you know and mixing it, and same for the other person. Creole is a mix of languages created from colonizer and colony. The best example to use is Haitian Creole, literally named after that language that exists. You have official languages. Countries will designate an official language supported by the country and the government to kind of push that language officially on all forms. And we know that other countries will have multiple official languages to help bring together ethnic minorities and stuff like that. But we'll talk about that in the Unit 4 review video. And fun fact, the US does not have an official language, in case that comes up on the AP exam. Alright, then you have isolated languages. These are ones that are completely unrelated to another. They don't have a family tree that then branches to different branches and then to different groups. It's literally straight line from family branch to group. The Basque language is a fantastic example of this because they are isolated completely in the mountains, in the Pyrenees Mountains, between the Spanish and French border. So they have never had an impact on their language. I believe Japanese is this way and Korean is the same way too. And this takes us to language extinction. The fact is that of the 7,000 world languages, half of them are facing extinction, and they are in places that have been colonized. This isn't a matter of developed versus developing. This is just what places have been colonized, and this is where you'll find languages going away because of this cultural imperialism that happened, and through actual colonialism and imperialism, forcing native peoples to speak the language of the colonizer. So today, 80% of the world's population only speaks about 5% of the world's languages. And where we see these languages disappearing overwhelmingly are places like Papua New Guinea, India, and the rainforests. Some hotspots for these native areas are the Amazon, Papua New Guinea, Australia, India, and Serbia. Notice that it's not MDCs versus LDCs. This is just places that have been colonized where we're seeing these languages go extinct. So why do languages go extinct? Well, as I mentioned, assimilation, acculturation, and cultural imperialism. The fact is, why would you speak a language that's associated with your folk culture that a couple thousand people are going to speak when you could speak a dominant language in the world where billions of people speak, which might give you more opportunities to move up and make more money and make yourselves a better life, right? And I mean, I'm not advocating to completely abandon these because there are reasons why we should keep these unique languages too. But this is why languages go extinct. And of course, the number one reason that languages disappear is because, yes, the people who are speaking it die and they might die out, but the fact is that they're not passing it on to the younger generation. And because the younger generation just doesn't see usefulness in speaking that language. So if there's no use for them to speak that language, then they're not going to learn that language. So places have tried to save these minority languages in the face of cultural imperialism and globalization. And the way that they do it is that they support the language by putting it up on government signs, producing TV shows, or writing newspaper articles and stuff in that language, teaching it in schools. But the most important thing to take from this, no matter what governments or countries try to put in place, you have to make it useful. If you don't make the language useful or important, no one will spend time to learn it. Because if they don't have a reason to speak it, then they're not going to speak it. So what are the reasons for promoting a minority language? The fact that it preserves local history, it creates a national pride, it gives a reason for tourism, because tourists really like to see stuff like that. Languages that have been saved are Welsh and Gaelic in the UK, Breton in France, and Hebrew in Israel. Whether it be through preserving that history, having that national pride, or promoting tourism. Because this isn't something that is unique to a country, that it can bring people together. Alright, now we're moving on to our religion chapter, which is significantly cut down. It's going to be really straightforward. You have to know the difference between universalizing and ethnic religions. The fact that universalizing religions are ones that anybody can convert to, and ethnic religions are really tied to the people and you can't convert to those. So, as I mentioned, universalizing religions are very much like pop culture. It can be practiced by anybody, heterogeneous groups. It spreads contagiously through expansion and diffusion, and our examples of these are Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Syncretism. Where ethnic religions are very much like folk culture, they're practiced by one unique group of people. They spread through relocation diffusion, and our two ethnic religions you need to know are Hinduism and Judaism. Like languages, we can split our religions into to structures. At first, you have your overall religion, which then each religion has its branches, and then in the branches they have denominations, and then in a denomination you have a sect, right? And you really don't need to know all the specifics for every religion. You just have to understand that we break apart religions the same way that we break apart languages, right? On branches they have things in common tied to the main religion. The best example to use for this is to use Christianity. We know that Christianity is the religion, the branch, the three main branches that you have to know are Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant. You really don't need to go further with the denominations and the individual sects. So religions can be hierarchical or autonomous. The only hierarchical religion you need to know that has a hierarchy of authority is really Catholicism, with like the Pope to the archbishops to the bishops to the priests. Other religions are generally autonomous. They don't have like a governing body. Now, I'm going to quickly go through each of the main points of each religion and kind of explain why they are where they are today, if that makes sense. So we know that Christianity originated in the Middle East with Jesus Christ, and it's diffused out by missionaries. Today, Christianity is all around the world, from Europe to Africa, North America, South America to Australia, either carried out by those missionaries, carried out by colonialism, and this also pushed the Indo-European languages along with Christianity. As I mentioned, the three main branches of Christianity are Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox, Catholics being the largest, Eastern Orthodox being the smallest. And they have basic beliefs, the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. There's no special dietary restrictions really. But when we talk about Christianity, why is it that it spread all throughout the world? Yes, it has to do with colonialism and imperialism, but it's the idea that in Christianity that anybody can be saved. So that was a very popular thing to preach to people, and that really made them buy in to Christianity, and why so many people have converted, because in its religion, it's the idea that anybody can be saved. You don't have to be like the chosen people. And special architecture with Christianity, obviously a reflection of culture, is specifically with the Eastern Orthodox churches with the domes representing heaven. So you might see that on the AP exam, and you'll have to relate it to an area or religion. Then we move to Islam, which also originated in the Middle East, one of our Abrahamic religions, this time with the Prophet Muhammad. It diffuses out in the Middle East by Muslim traders and the armies. And today, currently in the Middle East, South Asia, all the stands throughout Central Asia and North Africa. We also have to remember that the most populated Muslim countries are not in the Middle East. They are Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Egypt. Now, why did Islam spread so much? Well, very similar to Christianity, anybody could be saved. So this was a very popular thing to convert to. On top of that, it was very much when in the times of the Muslim armies and traders, that if you were a trader and you were traveling along the Silk Roads, if you ran into Muslim traders, then you were a friend, and maybe you got better deals. So people converted out of, what's the word I'm looking for? Opportunity? So yeah, people converted out of opportunity, not just faith. There are two major branches of Islam, the Sunni and Shia. Shia are the smaller branch of Islam. It is known as like the Shia Crescent. Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan are the most populated Shia countries. And then you have Sunni, which is the larger branch of Islam. Those are going to be basically all the other countries where you have a majority of Sunni Islam Muslims. The basic beliefs are on the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. They follow the Quran and the 5 pillars. There are dietary restrictions. They are similar to the Jewish kosher laws. And the city of Mecca is incredibly important to Saudi Arabia because it's the spiritual center of Islam with the Kaaba. And then their special architecture are mosques. You can identify mosques by seeing the dome roofed in the center, and then the large towers at the corners where you hear the call to prayer, which are called minarets. Then we get to Buddhism. It originates out of Northeast India, spreads out through East and Southeast Asia. Today, currently, most Buddhists are in East and Southeast Asia. There are branches, the Mahayana, Hinayana, and Theravada. I don't think you need to know that, but the basic teachings are the followings of Siddhartha Gautama, or the original Buddha. Now, what's unique about Buddhism and why so many people practice this one, because it is a universalizing religion, is the idea that anybody can practice Buddhism and it doesn't take you away from your other religions. Like, Buddhists are very okay with you being a Buddhist and a Christian, a Buddhist and a Muslim, Buddhist and practice Confucianism, and that's why so many people in Southeast and East Asia practice multiple religions is because they are unique in the fact that they are okay with that. A special architecture associated with Buddhism are the Buddhist temples or the pagodas. You can identify them by the upturned roofs and the very brightly decorated tile roofs. Now we move to Hinduism. This is in Central Asia, diffuses out of India by the Aryans, carried into India because it started in Central Asia, but now it is predominantly in India. And like our first ethnic religion, ethnic religions and folk cultures generally stay in the places where they start. And that's why today, where 97% of Hindus in the world, they're in India. There are significant numbers of other religions in India, but India is predominantly Hindu. The main beliefs that AP wants you to know, they consider this a polytheistic religion because it has so many gods. They do believe in reincarnation, similar to Buddhism, and they follow the caste system. Now, people argue all the time about whether or not Hinduism is polytheistic. Even people that practice Hinduism argue if it's polytheistic or monotheistic. Is it multiple gods? Is it one god? AP wants you to consider it polytheistic just to keep it simple. And then we get to Judaism, which also originates out of the Middle East. It's our third Abrahamic religion. It was the first Abrahamic religion because it literally started with Abraham. And then later we get, Christianity and Islam. But Judaism has spread most oftentimes because of the persecution of the Jewish people. Their current location overwhelmingly is the state of Israel, with significant populations in Europe and the United States. They have the kosher dietary laws, and they follow the teachings of the Torah. Now, you cannot convert to Judaism. You have to be one of the chosen people, a descendant of Abraham. Now, there are more progressive branches of Judaism that have popped up recently that do allow people to convert. But for the AP exam, you should just understand that Hinduism and Judaism are ethnic religions where you have to be born into the religion, and that is the only way to practice it. And then if you look at religions throughout the world, just have a general idea of where they're practiced to keep it simple. We know that Hinduism is predominantly in India, and we know that Judaism is predominantly in Israel. So after that, it's really just placing our other religions, Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, which we know all Buddhists are in East and Southeast Asia, so it takes care of that. And then placing, our Christianity in the Western Hemisphere in Europe, and then we split with Islam and Christianity in the continent of Africa, and then the Middle East is predominantly Islam. So pretty straightforward, easy thing to do. So what do you need to know from this? Basically everything in Unit 3, and how does it connect to other content? I gotta say, this is generally a pretty unpopular and not frequently asked unit that we study in AP Human Geography. But with what's going on with testing this year, pretty good chance that we're going to see topics from this unit used to explain other stuff, especially when we start talking about devolution and centrifugal and centripetal forces. So really make sure that you understand this content and how it connects to other things. So if you could do me a favor and hit that like button, hit subscribe, and make sure you hit the bell icon to get notifications so you can see updates when I create new videos so you stay up to date and prepared for the AP exam. As always, this was Bear's Guide to a 5, and we'll see you next time.